Hey everyone, Michael Park here for CreativeCow.net. In the first part of Project 1, we created a logo integration using the standard spheres from Particular. Now in this project, we're going to kick that up a notch and use some custom textures to create our logo. Let's get started. From the menu, choose Composition, New Composition. The first thing I want to do is create a source comp from where we'll get the textures for our particles. Let's name this source comp. And let's change the width to 400 and the height to 225, and 25 frames per second is good, and we need to change the duration to 1 frame. Now you'll see the reason for changing it to 1 frame in a second. In the project window, double click to bring up your import dialog box, and from the footage file I provided with your project, choose the cows folder and then hit Ctrl A to select all of the pictures and hit open. Now you should have imported 43 pictures of cows. Let's go ahead and put these in a separate folder to keep things straight. So create a new folder and let's name it cows. And then grab all of your cow textures and drop them into the folder. Great. Now with all the cow pictures selected, drop them into the source comp. Now what you've just done is imported all 43 layers one over each other, and they're all 1 frame in duration. The reason why we're doing this is we're going to be using each of these individual frames as a texture source for Particular later on. Now we need to sequence these layers so that Particular can take each layer. Right now this comp only has 1 frame, and so Particular will only source this top texture. So with the layer still selected, right click, choose Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. Make sure that your overlap is turned off and your duration is turned off and there's no transition, and click OK. Next thing we need to do is expand this composition out so that we have at least 43 frames in it. So with the source comp selected, choose Composition, Composition Settings, and let's set the duration. Instead of 1 frame, let's go 2 seconds in 1 frame and click OK. Now let's zoom out to see where our composition ends. And as you can see, this is our last layer on top. If you move your time indicator to the beginning of the last frame and hit in on your keyboard, you'll trim the work area. Then right click and choose Trim Comp to Work Area. Now the composition is the right duration for all of our pictures. Alright, next thing we need to do is create the composition in which we will have our particle animation. So from the menu, choose Composition, New Composition, and let's call this Explode. Now we're going to be doing effectively the same thing we did in the first project, only we'll be using these textures as our particles. From the preset, choose the HDV 720p setting at 25 frames per second, and let's change the duration to 8 seconds long. Click OK. First thing we need to do is take our source comp and drag it into our explode composition. You can turn off the eyeball switch, we aren't going to need it visible for this step. Next, let's create a new solid layer on which to put our Particular effect. So from the menu, choose New Solid, and let's call this Particular. Make sure it's comp size, and click OK. Next, let's add our Particular effect. So from the menu, choose Effect, Trapcode, Particular. Just so we can see what we're doing, let's toggle the transparency grid. If we scrub through the timeline, we get the default settings for Particular. Well, I guess next we need a source layer. So back in the project window, let's twirl up the cow so we have some room, and double click once again. This time go up a level and choose our AE logo, which is the Creative Cow logo, and let's drag this onto the timeline. Automatically it's centered in the middle, which is where we want it for this project. Make sure you make it a 3D layer because we're going to be using it as a source layer in Particular. And if you remember our last lesson, if we don't have it as a 3D layer, Particular will give you an error. In fact, let me show you what the error looks like. Let's go to the Particular settings and let's scroll down Emitter and change the emitter type from point to layer grid. Next, let's choose the layer emitter, and instead of none, let's use the AE logo PNG. And as you can see, it gives you this error message. Just to remind you that you need to have a 3D layer as a layer source. Click OK, and go ahead and make this a 3D layer. And as you can see, nothing really happens. You need to purge this setting in Particular, and the way you do that is simply select it again, choose None, and then select your layer again. Now if you scrub through, you can see it works correctly. Okay, let's tweak some of these settings a little bit. Let's change the particles per second from 100 to maybe 200. Let's change the direction from uniform to directional. Let's change the directional spread from 20 to 40. Let's change the velocity from 100 to 200. And let's change the velocity random from 20 to 50. Now if we scrub through the timeline, we see the particles really jetting off there pretty good. The next thing we need to do is change the grid emitter settings. Right now the default is 5 by 5. Let's change the particles in X to 120 and the particles in Y to 90. Now if you scrub through the timeline, you can see that the particles are emitted one time on frame 0, exactly what we want. But as you can see, they kind of die off rather quickly. So let's go ahead and change that. Let's twirl down the particle settings, and we could do a couple different things here. You could simply just scrub this value to a high enough value to where the particles all stay on in this composition. The only problem with doing that is if you ever change the duration of the composition, you'll have to come in here and change the life manually to make sure that the particles are the same length as your composition. While this might not seem too big of a deal for one layer of particular in a composition, if you have multiple layers or even 20, 30 layers of particular in a complex project, that could be a real pain. So the best solution I found is to use a simple expression. So let's alt-click the stopwatch, and in the expression box let's type this comp dot duration and click enter. Now as you can see, the particle life is 8 seconds, which is the length of our composition. If we change the composition settings to say 18 seconds, you can see that the life has now changed to 18. Let's go ahead and undo that change and go back to 8 seconds. But if we did need to make a change, we wouldn't have to update the life at all. The next thing we need to do is to kind of slow down these particles a little bit. We'll be using time remapping in this one as well, so I want to make some adjustments to the physics time. So let's go ahead and twirl down physics. Let's scrub through to about 3 seconds and 20 frames and set a keyframe for the physics time factor. We'll leave this at 1 and we'll go all the way over to 6, and we'll adjust this from 1 down to 0. Let's hit U to reveal those keyframes and select them both. Next, let's easy ease those. So we'll come in here and either hit F9 or right click and choose Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. Now if we scrub through the timeline, you can see the effect this has. All the particles start out fast and then slow down as they reach the end. Now it's time to change our little spheres here to our textures. Let's go back to the particle settings, and from the particle type dialog box choose Sprite, and then scroll down to the texture settings, and from layer choose source comp, and time sampling instead of current time choose random still frame. Now if we scrub through the timeline, you can see that all of our spheres have become little pictures. This looks okay, but the pictures still seem pretty far away, so let's add a little bit of wind to this composition. Let's twirl down the air physics, and in the wind Z, change that from 0 to -150. Now if you scrub through the timeline, you can see the effect this has. Now one note right here, you can see there's a little glitch, how the texture kind of pops on and off. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Well, what's happening there is you made a change in your dialog box, but that frame had already been rendered, and After Effects isn't re-rendering all the frames. It's cached that frame. This can actually be a problem if you go to render this out. After Effects will go ahead and read that frame as it's cached, and you'll have a glitch in your final render. The way to correct this is to go up to the menu and choose Edit, Purge, Image Caches. Now if you scrub through, everything looks perfect. Just a little handy tip for you. Anyway, let's get back to our project. We can probably go ahead and turn off the visibility for our source layer. There. That looks better. Next, let's do a quick RAM preview to see if we like this animation. Now obviously we're going to reverse this animation. We could go ahead and put this into a new composition and then reverse the timing on it, or there's a simpler way. Now I've hidden my RAM preview dialog box to make more room for this tutorial, but let me go ahead and bring it up. And in the settings here, instead of having it set to loop, have it loop back and forth. And I'm going to drag this down to the bottom here so that we can see this window. Now go ahead and do a quick RAM preview. And as you can see, the particles fly out, which is what we're doing in the normal composition. And then when it gets time reversed and loops backwards, all the particles come together, which gives us a preview of what's going to happen if we time reverse this layer. Now one thing I want to do is to have these full color at the start and then kind of fade into the color of the logo we have underneath. The best way to accomplish that is to duplicate the particular layer with all the settings applied and then just change one small setting. So I'm happy with this animation, so let's go ahead and do that. With the particular layer selected, let's go ahead and hit Control D to duplicate, and let's rename the top layer Particular Color. And let's get rid of this preview window. And now the only change we're going to make is in the particle type. Instead of sprite, choose Sprite Colorize. Now as you can see, all of the pictures have changed to a monochromatic tone of the source layer from which they came. So if we scroll back all the way to the beginning, you can see when they come together, they form the appropriately colored logo. Exactly what we want. Now what we need to do is to keyframe the transparency, so about halfway through their exodus from the layer source, they transition over to the colored frame. So let's go ahead and hit T with the particular colored layer, and let's scroll through here to about 113 looks good, and we'll set an opacity keyframe for 100, and let's scroll through just a little more and then set this to 0. And once again, let's easy ease this. You can hit F9 or right click, choose keyframe assistant, and choose easy ease. Now if you scrub through, you can see that towards the beginning they're all monochromatic, and then if we go towards the end, they're back to being full color. Now let's go ahead and set up our final composition. Now from the menu, choose Composition, New Composition. Let's call this Final Comp. Duration of 10 seconds this time. And make sure the settings are still 720p, 25 frames per second, and click OK. Now back in your project window, grab the Explode comp. If you don't see it, it's because it's probably in the Cal folder, because we had the Cal folder selected when we created it. All you need to do is drag it out here to the edge and it'll pop out of the folder, and you can close the Cal folder back up. Then take it and drop it into your final comp. Right click and choose Time Reverse Layer, and all of the particles start out here, and as time goes forward they sink into the logo. Next, let's take our logo and drag it on here. Since we created the logo in the middle in the Explode composition, we can just leave it right there in the middle. All the particles will come in and make up this logo. Let's go ahead and drop this layer below the Explode pre-comp. Now we need some sort of transition between these two. What we're going to use is another plugin from Trapcode called Trapcode Shine. Now if we were to apply Trapcode Shine to this layer as it is, the visual effect of shine will be constrained into the layer size itself. Let's just go ahead and show you what that looks like. We apply Trapcode Shine. You can see it's really bound by the size of the layer. Well, the way to get around that is to pre-compose. Let's go ahead and delete that off, and with the AE logo layer selected, choose Layer, Pre-compose, and move all attributes in a new composition and click OK. Now if we apply Shine, Effect, Shine, you can see that it hits the full extent of the composition, which is exactly what we want. Let's alter a couple of the settings of Shine here real quick. Drop down the Colorize, and instead of 3-color gradient, hit None. This will basically tell Shine to use the color of the underlying layer instead of recoloring everything. Next, let's change some of the settings of the ray length and the boost light so that this logo kind of blooms out and then recedes back in to cover the transition between the particles and the solid colored logo. Let's go ahead and keyframe the boost light and the ray length, and this is on 8 seconds, which is the end of our particle animation. And let's go ahead and kind of jack up this boost light so it's pretty bright. I think 7 will work nicely, and let's take the ray length out to 8. Let's turn the Explode layer off so that we don't have to render all those particles, and let's move back to 720 and take these down to 0, and then let's scrub through as it blooms out, then kind of a more gradual fade to about 820 and take these back down to 0. Then as you can scrub through here and see, you kind of have this bright bloom in and then it fades, which is what we want. But obviously we don't want this layer to be visible the entire time. So let's go ahead and come here to where it just first starts to bloom. Hit the T for opacity, set a keyframe, and let's move down a couple frames by hitting page down. Say 5 frames and set another keyframe. Let's go back to that first keyframe and change the opacity from 100 to 0. And then if we scrub through, you can see the bloom kind of comes on here. It's a little too dark. Let's change that a little bit. Maybe change the opacity to 50%. And then it'll bloom up and then fade in. Let's do a quick RAM preview of just that little section here. There we go. Kind of blooms in. Now, since we have the shine setting to be 50% opaque, and the layer is the entire length of the composition, you're going to have this in the background the entire time, which is not what we want. Let's go ahead and slide the time indicator down to the first keyframe of the opacity, and let's truncate that layer by hitting Alt open bracket. Now if you scrub back, you don't see it, and then it just kind of blooms on right where we want it. And let's go ahead and turn the explode layer back on, and let's flip-flop the layer position so the shine layer is over top the explode. Or let's change the transfer mode from normal to let's try add. So if we go back here, this will kind of add on top of the particles coming in and make them glow, which I think will give us a kind of a better transition so it's not so harsh. Let's do a quick RAM preview to see what that looks like. As you can see, it creates that nice transition and hides the transition between the particles and the solid layer. Looks pretty good. Alright, let's drag this back out to the full extent. And let's do one more thing here. Let's create the kind of a title logo underneath this that transitions on when the bloom happens. So let's grab our text tool and drop it down here. Let's say Creative Cow. Let's put this kind of in the middle here. And what I'm going to want to do is take this text, color it this green color, kind of make it blend in with everything, and change the font to Myriad Pro. Let's change the size to maybe 50 pixels. Okay, and we want this to come on right when the largest part of the bloom happens. So let's go ahead and turn the eyeball off on the explode so we can kind of run through this a little faster. Let's go to where that bloom happens and select the AE logo pre-comp, choose U, and let's come here to where the boost light and the ray length are the longest. That should be 100% there. Let's grab our text layer and hit T for opacity, and we'll see. Let's change this opacity. I don't know why that bumped to 90, but change that back up to 100, and change this opacity. And let's set a keyframe for the Creative Cow text opacity at 100. We'll drag that down to 0. Let's go down 5 frames, page down 5 times, and let's take the opacity up to 100 and drop this below. So now as it kind of blooms on, comes off, the text appears. There we go. Let's turn the explode layer back on. Let's go ahead and do a RAM preview and see what we have. After a quick RAM preview, here's what we have. Looks pretty good. Now, for those of you who watch Saturday Night Live, I'm going to channel my inner Christopher Walken. I need more cowbell. Well, maybe not more cowbell, but at least a little more cow. Let's go ahead and make this truly a divine bovine project. So in the project window, let's double click and import our cow BG texture. And let's go ahead and drop this in the background and hit S to bring up the scale and scale it down a little bit. Now, I don't want this to end on a white background because I just don't think it looks real good. So there's a couple things we could do. We could, try to move the texture around and scale it up until we get a black background, but man, it's mostly white. So I think the easiest thing to do is simply to invert it. So let's do that. With the Cow BG layer selected, choose Effect, Channel, Invert, And now you've got a black cow with white spots. Let's go ahead and adjust this a little bit over and scale it up a bit so that the logo is over top of the black fur of the cow. I think the final thing I want to do with this project is to kind of clip it off a little bit. You can see at the start you kind of have a whole lot of dead space here where nothing really happens until about 2 seconds where things start moving in. So I'm going to go to the 2-second mark and I'm going to bring the work area start in, and then I'm going to trim the comp to the work area again. So now we're back to an 8-second composition, which looks pretty good. You know, I think we can add one little additional bit of movement to really sell this. Let's go ahead and keyframe the scale value of the background layer so it looks like we're doing a little bit of a pull out. With the cow background layer selected and the time indicator on frame 0, let's set a keyframe for the scale. And let's zoom that in just a little bit, about 90%. Let's go to the end of the animation and let's go ahead and zoom this out to about 75%, and let's select both of those keyframes and easy ease those. I can see there's a little bit of clipping over here, so what we can do is just adjust this position over just a bit and maybe up just a hair. So now it stays in full frame. Alright, let's do another quick RAM preview and see what we've got. And here's what we got. Now obviously you can adjust this to whatever time you need. If you need the particles to come in faster, just adjust the physics time a little bit and you'll get exactly what you want. So all you need to do is grab your own pictures, throw them in there, grab your own logo, and plug that in, and you've got yourself a ready-made logo integration. Well, that's it for this tutorial. Until next time, this is Michael Park for CreativeCow.net.